You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael, on a Monday. The long-awaited book on the papacy by Erick Ybarra is now out, and I'm joined by Erick, who's going to talk to us about it. Welcome back to the show, Erick. How are you?
Oh, it's great to be back. Thank you for having me on. Yes, and it to your point, it's long awaited.
Yeah, it
Waited
seems
a
like
long time.
now the book itself, as far as you writing it, has been a period of how long?
Wow. So, I mean, I'll tell you, I started writing a book on the papacy, I want to say like 5 years ago. But I got so lost in my own mind that chapters ended up being like 70 pages.
Oh, okay. Right.
And I just knew that it wasn't going to be deliverable. So I had a couple of start and fails. This one I started in 2019. And I think you remember that I made a good portion of my way through the book, and then my hard drive burnt out. I don't know if you remember that.
I do.
And and so I lost a good portion of it, so I had to rewrite it.
Yeah, it wasn't the whole thing, but it was a fair amount.
The whole thing. Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So
rough. That it took a while. I think I turned in my manuscript at January of 2020. So it almost took just under 3 years, I think, to publish, because we're coming close to January 2023.
And it's published with Emmaus. Y'all can go to the show notes right there in the description, and there will be a link that takes you directly to it so you can purchase a copy. It's a pretty large tome here. You know, you have the tome of Damasus, the tome of Leo, and now we got the tome of Ybarra.
And this is not, I originally handed in a manuscript that was like 1,100 pages. So the editor there said we really need to trim off the fat. In fact, Scott Hahn called me on the phone and told me, he's like, this is a great book, but we're going to need to trim off a lot. Which makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So I took off a couple of appendixes that I wanted to have in there, and I put them up on the academia.edu. So like the Vigilius episode, like I had so much to write about that, I had to take out a lot. And there were some other things on like the epistemological considerations chapter. I went deep into some of the more Russian Slavophilic ideas, Kolmyakov, and basically that whole the whole movement that he created. And the peer reviewer said, he's like, you could do this in like half the work, so you don't need to talk about all this stuff. Which I don't know if that reflects how perhaps today, Catholics are not aware of how much the epistemological considerations play a role in this debate, and so they don't really, maybe they don't value it as much. But I spent a lot of time on that chapter, but I had to cut it up until like half of what it was.
Well, I mean, I think that as far as the finished product, this is awesome. It's a beautiful product, good size. I mean, so total, it's about 700 pages without the endnotes, if I recall.
Right.
It's like
Yeah.
720, something like that, without the endnotes. It's a good size for a treatment of this subject because there's so much to cover. So some people might think 700 pages, that's a lot. It's actually not, because there's so much more to really cover. You're just giving us a summary of it, but you do an excellent job at tackling the papacy pretty much throughout the ages and the debate between Catholics and Orthodox on it. Tell me a little bit about, before we dive into details, because I do want to get into some specific details, but tell me just kind of an overview. What are you really wanting us to take away from this work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, um, as as the audience probably remembers, I was an Anglican and I was quite happy, like you were,
Yeah,
um, where we could kind of bridge history,
yeah,
tradition, the scriptures, and all that.
yeah.
But as I was studying, I kept realizing that there's this novelty when it comes to ecclesiology that the Anglicans were carrying, and it kept bugging me. So I knew I had to go further back, and I had to be more honest, and that planted me at the fork between the Bosphorus and the Tiber. So between Rome and Constantinople. So I had to study this out, and I noticed that as an Anglican, I read a lot of the anti-papacy apologetics of the 19th century,
Mhm.
and like F.W. Puller, Edward Denny, and William Kerr. Even John Henry Newman had books against the papacy, like before
Mhm.
1845 when he was Anglican, and so I was never going to be converted by a catena of quotations. So I noticed some people moving from Anglicanism to Catholicism for that reason, and I just could never do that. So I knew that if I was ever going to do this, it would have to be a deep dive study into the matter. And it got to the point where I got so deep into this, I read so many books, talked with so many people, including yourself, that I just wanted to put this into document form. And what it is, it's basically just an investigation into the first 1,000 years on what did the mutual sources that both Catholics and Orthodox uphold as unquestionable say about the office of the St. Peter's successor. And so, but as I got into it, I realized that there's a couple of preliminary issues that not a lot of books that were written prior to had dealt with. So you had Father Adrian Fortescue, you've got um, Scott, I can't remember his first name, Herbert Scott, who was actually an Anglican when he wrote that. Trevor Jalan. You got a number of books that were written on the church and the papacy, but they didn't really single in as well on the issue of the Byzantine objections. And books that were written by professionals such as Dr. Locutus, James Locutus, um, I felt like I was in a position where I had spoken with enough Orthodox scholars, lay experts, and clergy that throughout the latter 2000s, perhaps Dr. Locutus didn't have the benefit of being able to have a social media venue to talk about these ideas, and have them really tested. So I knew that there needs to be another notch up in dealing with the Eastern Orthodox objections. And through that process, I learned that we need to nail down the issue of historical methodology. So that's one of the preliminary chapters, is on what is evidence? What are we both going to look at, an Orthodox person and a Catholic person, that amounts to evidence for the papacy? Because the whole thing of Peter being the head, Rome being the head, none of that's really baking any bread for either side. So we need to graduate from that into something more specific. So that's why at the opening there's the issue of methodology, hermeneutics, epistemology, and the big issue is development of doctrine. I have a whole
Mm.
chapter on development of doctrine, because I have, Orthodox, as they kind of look at the development of doctrine idea as kind of like a way to bridge the Grand Canyon. There's these
Mhm.
two things that are clearly not connected, and
Mhm.
yet we we connect them. Um, and so I realized that modern Orthodox, that's what they're doing. They're using that as a way to show that the Catholic Church is basically introducing novel teachings. Um, So I wanted to know if we could all get in the same laboratory, um, and we all understand that we have mutual sources, we have an equally recognizable historical method, we all recognize the epistemological considerations at hand that we should both understand are mutual, because it's often understood to be completely diametric, and the issue of development of doctrine. And if we have these instruments to study history, and now we can see what is it that's making us come to different conclusions, and so that's the other added benefit, I think, that prior books didn't really take care to detail on the issue of the Orthodox.
Seems like a lot of the prior books were dealing more with Anglicans and Protestants. You
Yeah.
think that's accurate?
Yeah. Yep. I think it is accurate. Yep.
So, I mean, this is certainly helpful. As you said, some of the other stuff that we have is a little outdated just because there are some responses from Orthodox that maybe those other works haven't taken into account. So I find this to be very helpful. What do you what is your perspective here? Do you think that this is, when it comes to the papal claims, is this just a slam dunk against Eastern Orthodoxy, or is there a strong case that can be made for the Eastern Orthodox in pushing back against the Catholic claims in the first millennium?
Yeah, so I do think that there's a strong case to be made for the Orthodox side. Sometimes, I'll hear something, whether it's from you or somebody else, where I think, oh no, maybe we have a really, really, really strong case. But then I'll hear something from the Orthodox, and it's like,
Mhm.
okay, we balance
Mhm.
out again.
Sure.
It seems like I keep coming through that, you
Mhm.
know, that's the
Sure.
sine wave. But yeah, I think the Orthodox have a good argument, um, and but here's the thing. I think a lot of the strength of their position comes from not so much inherent evidence for their position. See, I think that the papacy and the Catholic Church has inherent evidence, meaning the actual history points in the direction of the papacy.
Okay.
The Orthodox strength doesn't come from something that's inherent in them. It's not like we just see all this evidence of autocephaly everywhere
Mhm.
you read. That's not the case. It's more of they're able to take pot shots at some of our claims. You see what I mean?
Mhm.
So they're able to say, well, here's a papal failure, or well,
Mhm.
here's an instance where the church resorted to something different than the papacy in order to resolve a matter, or even like at the Fifth Council, where they're outright denying certain prerogatives
Mhm.
of the Roman Pontiff.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that at the end of the day, it is it is it's almost a tie just based on those things. But like I think I explain at the end of the book, if the papacy was proven wrong, or if Roman Catholicism was proven wrong, or something like that, I would not be able to say, okay, well, that automatically means the Orthodox are right, because um, if the Catholic Church is wrong, if the papacy is wrong, then so were all of its founding voices. So the fathers, the councils that all teach the papacy, well, they also have had to have been deceived as well. And if there's no other way to interpret them, if there's not another way to build a positive case for the Orthodox side, well, then their sources end up being unreliable as well, because they're shared with us. And at that point, um, I'd have to be fair and say that, if one loses, the other one loses too. So it's a different dynamic than just almost a tiebreaker. Because usually, if it's a tiebreaker, if one's wrong, automatically the other one's right. In this case, I don't see it that way.
Yeah, you've spoken before about how the papal claims are there in the DNA of these councils, and so that if, again, the papacy is wrong, then the Orthodox who maintain these councils are also wrong. But then you also mentioned there the case of the Fifth Council, where it seems that, at least for those council fathers, the papal claims aren't necessarily there because they don't have a problem attempting to suspend Vigilius. So they're not scrupulous about this idea that outside of communion with the Pope, there's no salvation, and communion with the Pope is communion with the Catholic Church, as perhaps the formula of Hormisdas would express it. So they don't seem to be scrupulous in that regard. They don't have a problem attempting to suspend him. But here's my thing. I think nobody wins with the Fifth Council because the council fathers there, I don't think really were upholding the papal claims. I think Vigilius was in favor of them, but the council fathers don't seem to be. Moreover, it seems that they were really being ran by the emperor. So you have here an instance of Caesaropapism in the council itself. So if any ecclesiology wins, it's Caesaropapism for the Fifth Council. What do you think about that? Do you agree, disagree?
I agree. And I think most historians I read on that subject, even Father Alexander Schmemann, who, not many realize, but he was a history professor at St. Sergius Institute in Europe before he moved on to be like a more liturgical specialist. Even Father Schmemann recognized that the emperor was really driving the steering wheel, and a number of the maneuvers that he made against the church really frustrated the liberty that belongs to the church. Because, I mean, if you take the history before the Fifth Council, so the Council of Ephesus, the Council of Chalcedon, and then if you take the history after the Fifth Council, so the Council of Constantinople 681, and then the Council of Nicaea 787, everybody seems to be singing in one choir that the Apostolic See is essential to have an ecumenical council, and not just essential like you've got 5 patriarchs, and if you're missing one, then you're just simply missing one of an equal in a series of equals. So we need the 5th one, or we need the 3rd one. No, that's not how they introduced the necessity of the Apostolic See. They always refer to the Petrine government that was established by Jesus as the reason for why the Apostolic See is necessary. And so it's out of sync with the other councils, this particular one, Constantinople 553. And it's quite obvious that Justinian had to depose the Patriarch of Alexandria, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. He had to handpick bishops that would lead churches in North Africa, and he had to come down with major threats to the well-being of these men, the clergy, the hierarchs of the East, and then obviously ultimately Pope Vigilius. So yeah, I think I told you before that some of the historians I've read, they even look at this as an example for why just organized religion is bad, just in general, because it always ends up being this struggle for power. And where there's a struggle for power, how can we say the Holy Spirit is moving? So yeah, there's no beauty, I don't think, in that council. Although in 681, the Greek bishops were able to beautify the whole thing as if there was no problem. They were able just to say, Vigilius and Justinian, they both worked together as victors over the heterodox at the council of the 200 and so fathers, God-inspired fathers. And it's like they just kind of paper over everything that took place. Now, Vigilius doesn't ever get remembered for his mistakes. I don't think any of the Byzantines brought him up, even in the debates. I mean, perhaps Photius, I doubt it, because Photius thought Vigilius was one of the holy saints of God in his treatise on the mystagogy of the Holy Spirit. So Vigilius gets remembered of blessed memory by all of his successors. So like Gregory the Great refers to him as of blessed memory. Agatho remembers him as of blessed memory. The only one that ever got remembered for doing something horrible is not even Liberius. Liberius is canonized in the East. Is Pope Honorius.
You know, what's interesting is in 867, whenever Photius attempts to judge the Holy See, something that had been well established prior to that as something that was out of bounds. Well, 869, Constantinople 869 comes around and says that he was wrong for that, and nobody has dared to judge the Holy See since the times of Dioscorus, which was, of course, 449 or so. So I kind of wonder why they didn't mention the attempt to suspend Vigilius by the Fifth Ecumenical Council.
He got forgotten. I mean, can you imagine, like that point you're bringing up there, Michael? They said that in a Byzantine audience in Constantinople. I mean, you've got to be crazy to bring up some legendary tale that everyone's bickering about in the presence of an ecumenical council like that, especially when you're there to, be an authoritative voice. They just, without shame, just completely lay it all out. Like, this has never been done since Dioscorus. It's quite a feat.
Yeah. And one thing you do address a lot in the book are various instances where popes speak about this notion of, the Holy See is judged by none, to paraphrase the phrasing. And I think it may not be Galasius who's the first, but he's certainly one who puts that forward, and you note that as well. Who's maybe the first one who puts that forward to your recollection, and then go ahead and also talk about some of the other popes who speak about this.
Yeah, that's very good. So explicitly, I want to say that the first person to talk about the what's the term, that he's immunity, there you go. The idea of being immune from ecclesiastical judgment or tribunal, it first comes out explicitly by non-popes, actually. So Italian bishops, so Saint Enodius of Pavia and Saint Avitus of Vienna, Italy, during the Symmachian versus Laurentian papal schism.
Oh, yes, right.
Yeah. Now, I agree with the historians who say that you could really find it in Galatius, but it's not as explicit. I think it's implicit in Pope Innocent the First, because when at least when it comes to doctrine, because when the African synods write to him, he basically says that that the See of Peter is stationed there in order that he kind of gives you this analogy of like a font and like the river that flows from it, that there has to be this font that's pure and undefiled, so that the rest of the churches that drink from the river that comes from it are drinking pure water. And he refers to it as an ancient rule, and then obviously roots it in the Petrine office given by Christ. But then somebody could say, well, that doesn't mean he's immune from ecclesiastical judgments if he came out as like a drug dealer. That you don't see until, like I said, Saint Avitus and Saint Enodius and Pope Saint Symmachus. But before that, you've got you've got a number of ingredients in Innocent, Zosimus, um, Leo the Great, and Gelasius that, to me, kind of amounts to it. It's more implicit, but I think it's explicit there in those saints at the year 498 to 502, with this internal schism in the West, and those saints are, like I mentioned in the book, those are not just Western voices.
Right.
Those are saints that the Eastern Orthodox venerate. So it's interesting. You see a lot of you see a lot of these stories and mythology being talked about online about how the papacy rests on forgeries.
Yeah.
And in so doing, they're throwing darts at the calendar of saints that they venerate.
Yeah. In along these lines, so the Symmachian forgerer, I think it's the Eastern Orthodox scholar Dr. Sachinski, whom we've both interviewed on this show multiple times. I think he notes in his work on the papacy that the Symmachian forgerer had access to Gelasius, who teaches this notion of the first see is judged by no one, but doesn't actually use him. But the point here is that um it's not the forgerer who introduces this, but it's something that was already there. And that what you note in the book is that it would be unreasonable for the forgerer to introduce something that nobody already believed. They were introducing something that others already maintained.
Yeah, I agree with that, because that's one of those chapters that I brought up on a historical methodology. We need to recognize that um, forgeries are not always going to be the best appeal to explain for doctrinal acceptance, because of the culture. These people were not psychologically fit for novelty. They were, they were fighting to their deaths in order to maintain the old ancient tradition. Gelasius, for example, he's famous for saying, "No, nothing new, no novelty,
Mhm.
only what has been handed down by our
Right.
fathers." He, quoting Proverbs, talking about not replacing the landmark of the fathers. And these are the kinds of arguments they're using against the East at the time.
Mhm.
The East was looked at as being the one of trying to replant institutions with the emperor, interestingly enough. But what's so interesting about the forgeries that we talked about, um, you had two sides. You had the Symmachian side, and then you had the Laurentius side. And what gets talked about online in the mythology in
Mhm.
Protestant, Anglican, Orthodox, casino tables, pseudo, I'm just joking around. When they're sitting back smoking cigars, talking about how the papacy is an invention, um, they talk about the Symmachian event, but they don't. So they'll say, well, Pope Symmachus, um, he had a ragtag full of bishops that were making up stories in order to prop up his authority. And then you had the Laurentius side, where they were the Orthodox and they recognized that the Roman pontiff could be judged. But what doesn't get talked about is that there were forgeries made up in order to prove Laurentius' side as well. So there were forgeries propped up at the time in order to support both the idea that the Roman pontiff could not be judged and that the Roman pontiff could be judged.
Mhm.
Um, so, um, and that the Roman pontiff, could run into a situation where he could be expelled from his office for sin. So you have to ask yourself, if forgery is proof of a deception, then both sides were a deception. And in that case, we need a third alternative for the truth. But there is no third alternative at the time. Um, so, like you said, I think that it's unfortunate that we have these proven forgeries. I mean, it's pretty well beyond shadow of doubt that some of them were forgeries, but they all held to the principle of what was being taught. They just thought that there weren't enough people being convinced for some reason, and so they wrote new material to try and fill in the gap. And what's interesting, a lot of those forgeries were never known to be forgeries by the saints of East or West. They continued to uphold those forgeries as if they were real. Even the Orthodox, all the way up to the Council of Florence, were upholding certain forgeries that spoke about the immunity of the Roman pontiff from being judged. So it's one of those inconsistencies that we find in the Byzantines. So it wasn't. We're talking until like the 16th century, where this revelation of forgeries really comes to the fore, and people start saying, yeah, this donation of Constantine, it's a complete forgery. The Symmachian documents against Laurentius, both the pro-Laurentius and the pro-Symmachian writings, were all forgeries. These are not things that people are aware of at the time.
One thing I heard the other day, and I was glad you addressed it in the book because I don't really hear people addressing it. One big objection is that Gregory the Great, monumental pope, right? They say, a lot of Orthodox, that he did not maintain papal supremacy. In fact, that he denied it. I had somebody the other day in the chat just insist that they said the main reason why they're Orthodox and not Catholic is because they read Gregory, and Gregory denies the papacy, and this strong figure who is against the papal claims. If somebody great like him could deny it, then certainly the papacy couldn't be true. Can you engage this? Is it in fact the case that Gregory the Great denied the papal claims, or was he a papal supremacist?
That's a great question. So usually when somebody comes with that idea about Pope St. Gregory the Great, it's usually based off of the controversy over the title ecumenical bishop or universal bishop, right? And the story goes in his letters to Alexandria, that there is no universal bishop, and the way he fixes that is by saying each of us are individual bishops within our own domain, and none of us is a head over the other. That's literally what he says. He appeals to the apostles, and he says, well, wasn't Peter the head of local communities when he was in Corinth or when he was in Jerusalem? James was head of Jerusalem when he was there. Paul was the head of another city when he was in his missions. And so it almost, you get the impression that Gregory believes in like pure autocephaly, and so, and I'll grant it, that's what he makes it sound like. But what a lot of Gregory scholars recognize is that as a monastic mind, he would kind of speak in hyperbole in order to undo any kind of trace of selfishness. And so there's even letters where he commands people within his church to do things, and he says, but far be it from me that I command anyone to do anything. Well, it's like, okay, well, he's literally saying that within his own underclergy that he can't command them to do anything. You see what I'm saying? It's obvious, we know that a bishop could issue a command, but what he's saying is that as far be it from me to even think that I'm above you, I'm your servant. He was big into this idea of being a servant of the servants of God. And so it can sound like that when he's talking about this issue of the universal bishop. The title itself was pompous in his mind. The idea was that you alone are the holder of all episcopal rights. So he's dealing with an extreme, and he's talking in extremes.
Mm.
But what Gregory scholars recognize, and this is not just Catholic scholars who read Gregory, these are also Protestant scholars that I cite from in the text, and even Orthodox scholars. Demacopoulos, George Demacopoulos, I quote from him on Gregory because he wrote extensively on him. You have to read his entire corpus, because in other letters and in other epistles and even commentaries on the scripture, he's very clear that when push comes to shove, the service of primacy can intervene with threats and authority. And so that's not he never wanted issues to get to that point, because he thought it was kind of going to contradict the monastic spirit. But there are instances where he felt like, no, this is reaching the high water mark, and this has to be done. And whenever he does that, he gives rationale for it. And that rationale is the same as his predecessors, and it's the same as his successors, namely that when Christ handed the keys to St. Peter, he gave him a universal headship that gets passed on to the Roman Church. And that as a result of that, with or without a synod, the Bishop of Rome could intervene in affairs within the West and within the East. And I quote from Yaroslav Pelikan, who read the Gregorian corpus. I quote from his last name is Dudin. He was one of the premier scholars in Gregory the Great in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, and then George Demacopoulos and a couple of others, and they all recognize that he can make it sound one way. Dudden actually says that Gregory was being deceitful. Now, I would not impute that to Pope Gregory the Great, but even scholars are recognizing that he was almost speaking out of both sides of his mouth. But I'm not going to carry that accusation, but it can almost appear that he was doing that, because whenever he did talk about the origin of the Roman primacy, he rooted it in St. Peter. And when he talked about the Alexandrine and the Antiochian primacy, he still held that they were subordinate to the Apostolic See, and for reasons that the Byzantines never shared from the point of the schism going forward. He never rooted it, for example, in the imperial status of the Roman city church. He always rooted it in the fact that Peter's historical throne was stationed in Rome, and that it has a reverberation in Alexandria and Antioch, but in subjection to the primary chair. And so at that point, you've got different rationale offered that you're going to read in any standard Eastern Orthodox markup on primacy, let alone Pope Gregory the Great.
Well, I'm glad you addressed the issue there of Alexandria and Antioch, because that's going to be the one that the Orthodox are going to load into the chamber when they cock their gun to shoot at Catholicism. They're going to say, but see, Gregory, he talks about these three Petrine sees, and they're all equal. And so the claims that he's making about the papacy in Rome really also applies to Alexandria and Antioch. But I think you rightly note in the book, not only are you again addressing the secondary sources that indicate he maintained this papal supremacy, but also you point out that he mentions in his epistles that there's no other see that is not, he knows of no other see that is not subject to the Roman pontiff, and that would then include Alexandria and Antioch. And I want to situate it historically. Gregory would have known the role that Cyril of Alexandria played on behalf of the papacy um, in the Council of Ephesus, and you have explicitly Cyril writing to the Pope saying, "Look, this guy Nestorius, I don't really have good feelings about him, but I need you to settle the matter. Is this guy Orthodox or is he heterodox? If he's Orthodox, I want you to tell all the churches that he's Orthodox so that we can know to have no problem with him. If he's heterodox, write to all the churches." Cyril is saying this to the Pope, Celestine, "write to all the churches so that we can know to avoid him." Here you have the Bishop of Alexandria submitting to the doctrinal authority of Rome. And Gregory would have known this. Do you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I don't even know if I put that in the chapter, but it would have been good to note that Gregory was well aware of, the past actions of Rome, almost using Alexandria as a legate at the councils. But yeah, I noticed that when Protestant, and I did too when I was an Anglican, I'm guilty of this. You just go to the letter to Eulogius of Alexandria. Gregory says there's one see in 3 places.
Right. Yeah.
Right. What's the implication from there? You got a trinity of one share of Peter and a trinity of location. Equality. That's all it means. But then you start to see what else he says, like you said it, that he knows of no other church that's not subject. So he believes that Alexandria and Antioch are subject to Rome. So then the question is, well, why would he say in one place that they're the see of one, just one chair?
Yeah.
But then in another place, talk about a hierarchy, which again goes back to what I was saying before, where scholars recognize that there's sometimes this inconsistency, but I think it's rooted in his hyperbolic language, his monastic zeal to sort of empty himself out, even when he was talking to his own bishops and priests. I'm not above you. I'm serving you. I'm just, you see what I'm saying? It's like he had that disposition. And so he probably wasn't going to be talking like Pope Gelasius or Pope Innocent, but I doubt he's going to condemn those fathers at the same time.
How much time do we have, by the way?
I have to go at 7:30 or 7:40.
So we got 30 minutes or so. Okay. That just letting me know, just so I can make sure to be on target here.
My end is 6:42. So so is that well, you're in Central.
I'm 5:40.
Okay,
yeah,
so
you
in your
got about
time,
30-40 minutes.
At your time, I would have to go at 6:40. That would be my last. That would be the last minute.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the Third Council, because I there mentioned the epistolary exchanges between Celestine and Cyril of Alexandria, which I find to be proof that, okay, this notion that these 3 Petrine sees it's very hard to maintain when Alexandria itself sees itself in submission to the Pope. Can you maybe talk about some of the other things that are brought out in the Acts of the Council of Ephesus? Perhaps Philip the Legate, which you address in the book. Can you maybe talk a little bit about him?
Yes, yeah. And this is a passage who the effect of which has been severely downplayed by Protestants and Orthodox readers, in my opinion. Even some Catholic scholars I've seen sort of overlook what's being said there. But at the Third Council, Council of Ephesus 431, like you said, there's all this pre workup where Celestine is basically, issuing binding decrees over the See of Constantinople. But when the council begins, and it began with Alexandria and Constantinople and Antioch weren't even there. So it was just Juvenal of Jerusalem, Cyril of Alexandria, and I think bishops from Philippi and other places before the legates even arrive. They're being guided by by Cyril, who introduces himself in the Acts as the one holding the place of Pope Celestine, which is interesting. How can you hold the place of an equal or an inferior? I think everybody at this point needs to recognize, Protestant, Orthodox, and Catholic, that Rome took a superior position at the Council of Ephesus. I saw recently an Orthodox person say, they said that, well, the popes were never present at the councils, so how could they even be considered authoritative? Well, just read the opening of each session at the Council of Ephesus, and you've got, go on. You want to say something?
Well, one point there is it not the case that one of the reasons why, at least practically at first, it was hard for them to attend, maybe in the case of the first council, but later on, popes seem to have refused to attend the councils because they kind of felt it was beneath them to be present. Is that accurate?
Yeah, in fact, it was at the Council of Ephesus 431, or no, it was at the Council of Chalcedon, where somebody, I guess maybe they just weren't well read in history. I think they inquired, well, why doesn't the Bishop of Rome come? And the legate said, well, according to ancient custom,
yeah,
the prelate of the Apostolic See does not come. So it's
I think
like,
that was first session, if I recall correctly. Yeah.
So it's like, well, wait a minute, like they're not even hiding the fact that he's not there. They're appealing to ancient custom for his absence, and it's like, well, why is that? Is it just because he's got to make a long, there's a long trek through, boat and horse, all the way? No, it's because he's got affairs in Rome, appeals coming to him from everywhere.
Yeah.
So anyhow, but Philip the legate at one of the sessions at Ephesus 431, he stands up to deliver his basically the instructions that were given to him by Pope Celestine, and based upon his reading of the codices that were given to him about what had been done up to their time that they came, because they got there late, and they make a strong claim to the divine institution. So they rooted the Roman primacy in Holy Scripture, and you just need to pause right there, because there's no reason to do that. There's no reason to do that if the kind of environment that we're in is, well, Rome's the seat of the empire. Primacies exist because of the geopolitical stratosphere, and the councils at Constantinople 1 and Chalcedon say that Rome was given primacy because it was the home of the emperor. And so, we kind of recognize this post-apostolic canonical primacy for Rome. That's not how Philip introduces the Apostolic See. He introduces it, and again, in an Eastern audience with no other person other than Boniface and the other one's Progentius. I can't remember the name, but he had 2 or 3 guys with him from home. So he's in the presence of Eastern bishops that he's never met in his life. And he stands up and he says, it has been known in all ages that Jesus Christ invested St. Peter with the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Well, again, this also can't be something that is looked upon as, oh, the keys are, each bishop has the keys, therefore Rome having the keys means nothing.
Yeah.
Well, not according to this council, right? And he stands up and says that this investiture of Christ and St. Peter is for not just for the disciplinary issues, but for the being the rock of faith, is what he's called, the rock. that Saint Peter is the rock of the faith, and that the powers of binding and loosing were given to Saint Peter, and that investiture, that deposit, you could say, that Christ put into Saint Peter is realized in the contemporary setting through Pope Celestine, his successor. And he says, in due succession, Celestine judges with the authority given by Christ to Saint Peter. Now, he introduces that because what are they there to do? They're there to make judgments about doctrine, about discipline, about boundaries, about all kinds of things, right? So, and the council there, as you've mentioned this before to your audience a few times, when Saint Cyril of Alexandria opened his mouth after Philip and Boniface gave their statements, Saint Cyril said that what they have said stands manifest to the council. And so you have there a very strong case for the divine institution of the papacy, as well as the perpetuity, because he uses the word forever.
Yeah.
For all ages, that this succession in due order, he rules over, Saint Peter rules over his see and the universal church forever.
Yeah.
So it's just such an irresponsible thing to be appealing to legendary tales at a place like this, at a time like that, and for a subject where souls are on the line,
And it seems that point that you're making there about successors forever seems to act against those who would say, but that primacy can be transferred to Constantinople, which I don't know who is Orthodox actually maintains that today, that there's that kind of primacy held by the Patriarch of Constantinople. It seems like there's an entire schism taking place right now in Orthodoxy over that issue. So I don't really know anybody who really maintains that. Except maybe just a few Orthodox who would say, okay, Constantinople exercises that kind of primacy.
Yeah.
Care to comment on the transferability of that primacy?
Yeah. So there's like you said, there are some voices in the Orthodox Church that are abundantly happy, ecstatically happy to say that the primacy of Rome was based off of this divine investiture between Christ and Peter. It's just they're none of the right voices, because the voices who speak on the government of Orthodoxy, namely the hierarchs themselves, they've all categorically denied this. So you've got some Meyendorff and other scholars who point to what's his name? Simeon of Thessaly, of Thessaloniki, Nilus Cabasilas, Nicetas of Nicomedia, where they all say, well, Rome was Peter. Yeah, he'll have all that authority. He just needs to be Orthodox.
Yeah.
But if you record the statements of the patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, all the way from the 13th century, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 8th, all the way up to the patriarchal encyclical of 1848, to the encyclical of 1895, all the way to the publications that made it into the ecumenical dialogue in the 1970s. None of them were holding to that position. And not even Patriarch Athenagoras, nor Patriarch Bartholomew, his successor, ever claimed that Roman primacy sat upon some sort of powers that were given to Peter from Christ and then descended to the Church of Rome. And especially today, the largest body of Orthodox Christians, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate has been for years now, for decades now, denying not only that there's a universal primacy based in St. Peter, but that
Mhm.
there's just universal primacy with any kind of jurisdiction for decades. So this issue of the transferability of primacy, that actually was a claim by the medieval Byzantines. They were using the donation of Constantine as their
Right.
appeal.
Right.
They were using the donation of Constantine as well as, the 3rd and 28th canon of Constantinople, 1 and Chalcedon, as well as Trullo. That the imperial
Mhm.
foundations of the Roman city church, moving from the Italian peninsula to that old backwater city Byzantium, is what beefed up the Church of Constantinople. And so now the Constantinople being the home of the new Rome, of being the capital home of the empire, now it kind of takes over the church at Rome. Now, that was never held programmatically in the first millennium. You start to see that claim with the Comnenas and the Paleologoses, that the era in the second millennium, where they start to talk that way. Like Alexius Comnenus even says that it was transferred completely, and Rome is now empty. That's a very unpopular view by the Eastern bishops in the first millennium. They still held Rome was the first, but some tried to make an equality between the two every now and then.
You mentioned their Canon 28 from Chalcedon. Of course, that's just simply repeating it in an expanded way. Canon 3 from 381, Constantinople 1. So, don't those canons undermine the papal claims? Doesn't this show maybe, for instance, that Chalcedon rejected papal supremacy by introducing Canon 28 that indicates that Constantinople has a primacy second to Rome not because of some divine institution of Rome, but because of its position in the empire?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that when I started studying this matter, I thought that too. I thought that it kind of looked like those canons were like a denial of
Mhm.
Roman primacy based off of the divine, you know, divine institution between Christ and Peter. And that it was just based off of this historical accident. It was a complete historical accident that Peter and Paul were able to make it over to Rome, and that's what made Rome. It's that has absolutely no basis in divinity whatsoever.
Mhm.
But and then I also thought that Leo annulling the canon also meant that Rome was rejecting the entire premise of the canon. But as I studied it further and further, and this really hit home for me when I read a document by Pope Pius XII, so all the way into the 1940s, who said that Canon 28 had no essential contradictory claim to the Petrine institution of the Roman primacy. And that threw me off at first, because it's like, why is he saying that there's no contradiction there? It's a blatant contradiction. One says that it's based off of the voice of Christ to Peter. Another one says that it's based off of this complete historical accident with the political prestige of the city of Rome. And as I researched things further, I understood that there's different senses to Rome's primacy.
Mm.
There's the primacy of Peter, that everybody kind of knew it was a universal court of appeal. Everyone reports to the head. Who's the head? Peter, right? But then there is this issue of matching the geopolitical format in order to conduct regional government of the church. And the Roman city church was going to take on a role that could not be matched by anybody in the West, neither by Aquilia or Ravenna, which later came up into prestige. But that the Roman Church would grow into what we call now a patriarchate, governing the whole all of Italy, um, all the surrounding islands under Italy, and it even grew to North Africa, Gaul, and England as centuries moved on. But Rome basically was managing the West, and it was based off of the fact that the Roman city church was the capital of the empire. In fact, Alexandria and Antioch, too, were premier cities in the Roman Empire. So those cities, too, were going to take on a level of premier status. But that is a separate category, even though there's an intersection here. And this is where it gets kind of confusing. There's an intersection here between the patriarchal organization or the patriarchal order and the Petrine order. Those two things come into intersection with Rome. And so Constantinople knows it has no chance of it being the chair of Peter. There has never been a claim, as far as I'm concerned, that the Constantinopolitan Patriarch is like the See of Peter. I've never seen that claim before. So it's obvious that what they were trying to do is they were trying to make Constantinople basically like a twin patriarch to Rome in the East. And so it would have extended jurisdiction over primary lands that were nearby, close to Ephesus, as far as Ephesus, and that it would outshadow Alexandria and Antioch. And so when Leo saw this, he didn't deny it. He didn't deny it based off of, oh, you guys have no idea how Rome got started. It's on totally different theory. No, what he saw was an imperialization of the church's ministry. That's what he saw. He saw that, yes, there is this element of Peter and Caesar, or the Augustus in Rome, but we can't pretend like we can just take this and run with it so we can just start making capital cities new hierarchies. So Leo said, no, there's an apostolicity in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch that can't be etched out. And so he took the position that Constantinople was making a power grab based off of a theory that it was welcomed, but only once. It shouldn't be welcomed anymore. So it doesn't really contradict the papacy, because Constantinople was just looking for a way to be basically what Rome was to the east, what Rome was in the west to the east. Yeah. And so they always knew that they were in subjection to the See of Peter. And that's clear by all of the patriarchs of Constantinople who were fans of Canon 28. They still recognized that they were in subjection to Rome. But you do have some exceptions that were kind of, they're trying to find loopholes.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to point that out, what Dr. Szymanski calls the principle of accommodation held by Leo. I'm sorry, it was Dvornik who called it originally the principle of accommodation, and Szymanski there talks about the principle of apostolicity held by Leo. Those two aren't mutually exclusive. It's possible to hold to both without one contradicting the other. And I found that to be helpful. So in the case of Canon 28, I don't see that as absolutely exclusive and contradictory to the principle of apostolicity expressed by Leo and predecessors. So I find that to be helpful. And you go over that in the book, and you also address some of the other points that we see in the corpus of Leo that helps substantiate the papal claims. One that I wanted to get to is the formula of Hormisdas. Can you properly and historically situate this for us? Tell us a little bit about some of its claims, especially in relation to equating unity with Rome to being unity with the Catholic
Mm,
Church, and then
mhm.
tell us about some of the responses that Orthodox apologists offer to the formula of Hormisdas.
Yeah. So the formula of Hormisdas, it was basically an answer to uh, emperors in the East who were basically fed up with the disunity in the church. And they wanted the Eastern churches to return into communion with the Roman See. And so this is following Chalcedon and the aftermath of 5th century Christological disputes that really broke apart the East. Um, and which is interesting because the 4th century was marked by Christological debates in the East, breaking things up. Like Jerome, when he writes to Damasus, he says
You're muted. You said when Jerome was writing to Damasus, and
sorry,
you got muted
yeah,
there. Yeah.
sorry, yeah. When Jerome was writing to Damasus, he spoke about how the East was broken into pieces because of the
Mhm.
issue of the hypostases and the ousia. Um, and
Right.
then in the 5th century, you have the same thing. This is problem of understanding how to envision Christ's the Christology in light of his divinity,
Mhm.
and it wrecked the church in the East. You had this division between those who held Chalcedon and those who didn't. Well, the emperors decided, okay, we need to ask Rome for how to clean this up
Mhm.
and go along with what Rome instructs us to do. So that task fell into the hands of Pope Anastasius, and at the end of the 5th century, um, Pope Simplicius, and it really starts under Galasius when he was basically like the secretary at Rome, but it wasn't until the beginning of the 6th century, 515, where Pope Hormisdas basically wrote a formula and it's interesting. It's not just like, hey, you will believe all these things.
Mhm.
He actually wrote it in such a way that it would be a statement from them to
Mhm.
him.
Mhm.
So it was a libellus, basically stating the terms of communion. Just by doing that, you're giving this idea that you're in a position to make binding requirements.
Mhm.
You're not only giving the conditions, you're
Right.
also writing it out for them, and they have to sign it as if they're saying it to the Apostolic See. And in that document, you have a bold claim from Matthew 16 to the primacy of the Roman See from the promise of Christ to St. Peter, that the Apostolic See um, is that the Catholic religion, the tradition of the apostles, has never been it's always been unsullied
Mhm.
from error, right?
Mhm.
And then it goes on to say that, Leo and Chalcedon have to be confessed as true. Not just Leo, but all the letters of Leo that he wrote on the Catholic religion. And that what all the popes have said in the past has been right. And they had to anathematize certain names. They had to anathematize Acacius. Um, they had to anathematize other predecessors to John that went along with Acacius, or at least they seemed to go along with Acacius. And so this was a bold claim to papal infallibility, resting upon a scriptural foundation in Matthew 16. Um, Again, that's par for the course at Rome. Um, so this gets sent to the East through legates. One of those legates is Saint Honorius of Pavia, the guy that is responsible for being one of the first authors to talk about the immunity of the Roman pontiff from judgment for for sinful behavior. Legates get sent to the east, including Saint Enodius, and they're able to acquire all kinds of signatures in Constantinople. I have the English translation of a number of the exchanges between Emperor Justin and his nephew Justinian with Pope Hormisdas. And the legates at Rome said that they were very successful in getting lots of signatures in the East. But what ended up happening is that not everybody could follow along with the dictates that Hormisdas put out in his formula, because they thought that they could not excommunicate every single bishop that was outwardly in communion with Acacius, because some of those bishops didn't agree with the Hinodicon, but they were under duress, or that they held to Chalcedon the whole time, and that it would be against their conscience to condemn them posthumously, now them being in the grave. And so Justinian initially applied some force. He's like, no, this is what the Pope said. This is what you have to do. And the messengers just kept coming back to Constantinople saying, look, these people are willing to die. They're not going to do this, So what Emperor Justin did was he wrote back to the Pope Hormisdas and said, look, they all want to sign, but they cannot remove the names of certain people from their diptychs with good conscience. And no matter what threats are being used, no matter what coercion is being used, they won't do it. And the Pope initially just said, just keep doing that. So you got a little bit of, stubbornness on the part of Rome on this part. But then Justinian stepped in, and Justinian was more persuasive to Hormisdas. And Hormisdas finally said, you know what? All right. You guys can fudge the names, except for Acacius, and the removal of Macedonius and another name from the venerable names, But Acacius has to be, removed from the diptychs and anathematized. But the other names, suffice it to say, as long as they agree with everything else in the tome or in the formula, they can send in their own libellus and hand it into Constantinople, and that would suffice for them to enter into communion with the Holy See. And so that ended the episode. What Orthodox people like to do is they like to retell a story based off of the Eastern voices that couldn't sign the original. And so here's where quite a vast imagination kicks in. The story kind of goes like this, and I'm sure they won't like me describing it this way, but this is kind of what they're saying. The Eastern bishops saw the papal infallible claims, and they're like, no way we can believe in this heretical nonsense. And so we're not going to sign this original one. Tell them we'll sign a different one of our own, which is not going to have papal infallibility in it or any of the papal claims in it. And if he accepts that, then we'll enter into communion with Rome. And that seems to be the, how that you have that what's that game, the telephone game where you whisper into an ear and at the end it comes out like totally opposite. Well, you've got
telephone game. Yeah,
telephone game. You got these Orthodox polemicists who try to concoct this story. I don't see it in any of the scholars of the Orthodox world, but you get Orthodox polemicists who bring this up, and then through the telephone game on the internet, you get this idea that I've even heard an article called the sham of the formula of Hormisdas, where the Easterners basically got the victory in the end and completely denied the papacy. Well, as I was saying, none of the Eastern bishops made a peep about the papal claims. And even if they did have a problem with it and voiced their problem on other matters, that looks really bad on them. It looks really bad on them to enter into communion with Rome while they know that Rome holds to papal heresies, just because the Pope is agreeable to other conditions. I mean, that's kind of like the same thing they complain about today, where you've got the false unity, this unity of outward communion without the equality of faith. Well, this whole imagination about the sham of the formula Hormisdas really plays upon this will of the Byzantines or the Easterners to enter into a false unity with papal heresy, as long as they don't have to sign on to the papal heresies themselves. And that's just, it's mythology. It's a complete myth. Even we've already cited him before, but he's worth mentioning again. And you've brought this up to your audience a few times. Father Alexander Schmemann even admitted that this was accepted by the East without contest. Even Father Meyendorff, who's normally not disposed to admit this, even he says that it's seen as a victory for Rome. Rome was very clear about its beliefs. You know, there was no obscurity or ambiguity at this point in time in Rome. The publicity there was all the same. And the Easterners knew what they were joining when they signed that formula. So, to this day, the Coptic and Syriac communities, they all see it as what it was, a submission to the papal throne. And they, they think, they look back and see it as an act of betrayal on the part of their Eastern brethren who signed the formula. But yeah, so that's what you hear from Orthodox apologists today. There's so much more to be said, but that's kind of like the summary.
Let's shift gears to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, because I want to get to two aspects about it. Let's first talk about Agatho and his work there at the council and some of the papal implications, and then I want to offer, of course, the obvious pushback that some Orthodox would bring up. But let's start with Agatho first. In your work and your research, his letter to the emperor read out at the council, you would maintain that it teaches papal indefectibility and supremacy, correct?
Yeah. It's very clear.
Yeah. And this is, again, read out at the council and accepted by the council. Does this then mean that the council fathers were signing off on the papal claims?
I think so. And what's interesting is, that whole argument that Orthodox and Protestants make about how at Chalcedon they had to read the tome before they accepted it. So therefore, papacy's gone. Well, I think it works against them when it happens at this council, because George of Constantinople, he's the patriarch of Constantinople, when he read the tome of Agatho, he says, I read it from beginning to end, and when I compare it to the tradition of the fathers, I find them to be equal with each other. Right? So somebody might say, oh, look at that. He's having to scrutinize the letter of Agatho. But it works against the Orthodox to belabor the point, because if he scrutinized Agatho's document that closely, then that means that he did accept the papal claims. And so I think that at this council, that whole idea of scrutinizing papal letters before they accept it actually works against the whole narrative of denying the papacy.
I think that's a really good point. I think you're probably the only one that I've really heard bring that up. Now, again, the obvious response that an Orthodox is probably going to bring up is, but you're telling me the same group that accepted papal infallibility and Agatho, who claims in that letter that all of his previous predecessors were undefiled by heresy, the council is then accepting this. But then the council goes and condemns Honorius as a heretic. Doesn't that mean then that you have a false reading of Agatho and the council fathers?
Yeah, this is a really difficult part of this council because, you know, Agatho makes such a bold claim to papal infallibility, and his understanding of that is that all of his predecessors taught
Yep.
the Orthodox faith. Now, is it possible he meant just their like constitutional decrees? That's possible. I don't want to take that away from
Sure.
the historical reasoning here. But it kind of looks like he just means everything that they taught. And so just one predecessor who gets proven to be a heretic would almost seem to challenge the entire canvas of what Agatho said. But the problem with that is there is no denial of what Agatho said about the papacy. And in their letters to the Pope after the council was being concluded, they wrote a letter to Pope Agatho. Well, it as you know, it fell into the lap of Pope Leo II. But
Right.
they wrote a letter to Agatho.
Sure.
They wrote a letter to the emperor. They wrote a letter to their home churches, all saying that the divine voice of Saint Peter has spoken from heaven, and a heavenly inspired document is what won the day. Yeah, maybe there's some Byzantine flattery there, but what are they saying? They're saying that they liked it.
Yeah.
They're saying they liked it.
It can't mean absolutely nothing.
Right,
Right?
exactly.
It means at least something favorable.
Yeah. So you've got what looks to be a tension between Honorius's condemnation and Agatho's claim to papal infallibility. And what's so remarkable is that there's, as far as I know, and I've actually consulted the scholar who's working with Father Richard Price on the Acts of Constantinople 681, which he hopes to be done in January.
Can he please release that, please?
Right. Yeah, he hopes to be done in January. Then I don't know what Liverpool is going to do after that.
I don't know, but I want to complete my set. So they need to hurry up.
But even I asked him, I said, this just looks like a blatant contradiction. Like, what do you think?
All right.
And he says, I agree with you. It's just a blatant contradiction. And so nobody resolves it. Not at the Pope. The Pope doesn't seem to try to like, well, here's how we understand this. He doesn't do that. Nobody does it.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of just gets left alone.
Yeah. Yeah, and then they don't really talk about
alone.
Honorius much after that, which is pretty weird. It doesn't come up in polemics against Catholicism by the East. I mean, against the papacy. It doesn't really come up.
No, because at the Council of Nicaea too, Hadrian. I'm sorry. At Council of Nicaea too, the Hadrian said that the Roman See has never turned away, and at the Council of Constantinople 869, they cited the libellus Hormisdas, which said the same thing. But then they also brought up Honorius at that council too. So it just doesn't get resolved. But I do think, and I think you've talked about this to your audience before, we're not left completely dehydrated.
Yeah.
We have some cactuses in the desert to try and resolve this. There's Maximus's defense of Honorius.
Right.
Because this is one of those issues that the Orthodox, polemicists. I'm not talking about just Orthodox who are good-willed, who are willing to look at the evidence together, but Orthodox polemicists will really pound on the Honorius thing they added Honorius's name because he agreed with Sergius on everything, right? Well, what about Maximus, who agreed with Honorius on everything?
Yeah. Or John IV.
Or John IV, who Maximus referred to John IV as one of the saints of God, right? He venerated.
Is that in his debate with Pyrrhus?
Yeah, that's in his debate with Pyrrhus or Pyrrhus or Pyrrhus.
Yeah, however
whatever.
you say it.
Yeah. So that's an inconsistency right there. And then obviously you have the letter of Anastasius in the 8th century or the 9th century. Well, he's like the chief archivist in Rome, and he doesn't feel any pressure to take the council over the Pope and Maximus.
And you were, I think, the first one to point out to me that he mentions that a council can err in matters of fact. He's the first one to mention that, and it's right there in the first millennium. So these aren't distinctions that are just completely foreign to the first millennium. At least that one is present at that time. And I think that there are some ways to resolve that tension between the council affirming papal infallibility and what Honorius, what is said by Agatho about his predecessors, and then their claim about Honorius. But I grant that it's not necessarily something that they explicitly resolve themselves. It's something that we have to read into it. But I don't think it's necessarily, when I say reading into something, I don't think it's necessarily something foreign to the situation. I just think I'm having to make explicit something that might just have been assumed by them. Care to comment on that? Do you think that there's a way to perhaps resolve with some of these distinctions that we use today, the situation taking place with Honorius?
Absolutely. I mean, some of these guys that spoke in the first millennium were just clearly extremists. I had learned from Father Richard Price, that Justinian was actually the first one to say that a council could err on a matter of not related to dogma.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I learned it because when he was in that tussle with Vigilius and the East, one of the big issues was that there was just so much evidence that the 10th session of Chalcedon had accepted the letter of Ebus to Marie the Persian. And Justinian got so annoyed by this, he just said, well, look, like, they didn't talk about the letter. They just said that, he's Orthodox based on the letter. It's just it's not a piece of the dogmatic.
Oh, is that the part where Price is talking about conciliar fundamentalism?
Yeah.
And yeah, that's right. It's been a while since I've read through that. So he was rejecting conciliar fundamentalism, but there were some who were maintaining it at that time.
Yeah, he knew he was a diplomat at the same time as he was a dictator. So he just went along with the bishops, but I don't think he personally cared.
Yeah.
But then you've also got Pope Pelagius II and Pope Gregory I. They make the claim that at Constantinople I, that only the creed was accepted, and not the acts of that council.
I've seen that before. Yeah.
And then also some made the claim that Chalcedon was not accepted in full because Leo said that it only accepts what was talked about by faith. But that's not what Leo intended to write. But you already see brewing rather, this idea that parts of councils are unquestionably infallible.
And if Justinian maintained that, then I guess we could also throw out the session that, I know it was later on scrubbed from the Acts, but I guess we could throw out the part where they attempt to suspend Vigilius.
Oh yeah,
they can err on that too. So.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, and this really, I caught it at the last moment before I turned in my manuscript. I came across the, let's see if I have that book around here. I'm not sure if I do, but it was a Byzantine scholar who wrote about the Fifth Council, and he pointed me to a he as a Greek Orthodox scholar in textual transmission,
Mhm.
and he actually is famous for writing the intro to the critical addiction of the Acts of Constantinople 553.
Mhm.
And he claims that before Vigilius left Constantinople, Justinian scrubbed the
Mhm.
entire indictment on Vigilius from the Acts. And that would explain why Vigilius never comes up again,
Right.
as a, and he's known right away as of blessed memory.
Mhm.
And Vigilius, this is something that some of the Orthodox polemicists don't realize, is that Vigilius never recanted anything.
Mhm.
He always said that he maintained the four councils, um, but that he was misled, about the meaning of a certain letter.
Mhm.
Um, but he never came out and said, you know, I held to the, to Nestorianism,
Mhm.
um, by what I said. He basically said that we all held the truth. We were just mistaken on a matter. So Vigilius never really agreed to him being a heretic, which
Mhm.
is normally what you would require from somebody before you exonerate them.
Mhm.
I mean, when Theodoret was exonerated, he had to anathematize, Nestorius and those writings. So in Vigilius's letter to Euphemius or Eutychius of Constantinople, and in his final Constitutum, he's emphatic that he's always held to the truth.
Mhm.
It's just a matter of the issue of letter of Ibas, really, and the issue of condemning people posthumously. That's the only thing I could say that he flip flopped on. Which today we've actually flip flopped in the other direction again. So we don't really do posthumous condemnations anyway. So yeah, look, we're Orthodoxy, Oriental Orthodoxy, Catholicism. We're all liable to be decapitated if we keep these conditions so sensitive to error.
Mhm.
Um, all of our heads are liable to be chopped off
Mhm.
unless we make these conditions.
Yeah. Now I know you got to go here. So one final question. You mentioned there the Seventh Ecumenical Council and Hadrian's claims. You know that some are going to push back on that and say, but the Greek text, it
Oh
doesn't,
yeah,
have the papal claims and all
yeah.
that. So, what's your response that you offer in the book to that?
Well, the first thing I want to recognize is that those Orthodox or Protestant scholars who um, that's part of their rebuttal to the papal claims, that means they recognize that Hadrian at least taught some unacceptable claims about the papacy, you know, which means, and see, this doesn't hurt a Protestant that much, because a Protestant, Hadrian could have been a papal heretic being carried around by slaves all day and in his, wearing his tiara and, you know, venerating idols. The Protestant doesn't care about the stature of
Mm.
the chief hierarch of the Seventh Holy and Ecumenical Council. But when Protestant scholars are saying, and Orthodox scholars are all saying, that what Hadrian wrote was absolutely abysmal and was taken out of the Acts, what they're saying is that the holy head and chief of the Seventh Ecumenical Council was a papal heretic
All right.
that was untried and uncondemned.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that hurts the Orthodox side. And I don't, for those Orthodox who are listening, I'm not trying to be comical and laugh at you. I'm just
Mhm.
trying, we could all get a
At the
kick out of
position.
this. Yeah, we
Well,
could
I
all get a
mean,
kick
does
out of it.
and also, aside from the issue that again the text probably was altered at a later time, let's say that they get Hadrian's letter and they alter the text at that time, which I know again that's not where the scholarship leans, but let's say it happened at the time of the council. Wouldn't that then mean that the recipients knew that they were in communion with a papal heretic?
Yeah, that means that they were irresponsibly lackadaisical with who they're in communion with, which doesn't psychologically fit, because they were just under persecution from the iconoclastic emperors, willing to die
Mhm.
over the issue of icons. So these are people who are adamant about keeping to the tradition. They're willing to spill their blood over the ancient apostolic tradition.
Mm.
So for these people to psychologically just waltz in where angels dare to tread into communion with a heretic, it just doesn't fit psychologically. This is one of those mitigations to the theory that the Orthodox give about the Hadrian letters.
Mhm. Yeah, fair enough. Now, again, like I said, I know you got to head out here, so I just once again want to remind everybody, go and purchase a copy. There's a link there in the description. This is the Papacy subtitle, Revisiting the Debate Between Catholics and Orthodox by Erick Ybarra. Erick, any parting words, anything that you want to make the viewers aware of, any plugs that you want to put in?
Yeah, no. This is my first extensive interview on the book, and so I'm happy to give it here at Reason and Theology. Quite appropriate, right?
Yeah.
And if it's I think it's better to buy at the St. Paul Center website, because I think people get it faster.
Mhm.
And also I get more rewards if
Ah,
you buy it
well,
through
I got
St.
a
Paul.
link to that one in the
Yeah.
description. It's the one that St.
Yeah.
Paul. Yeah.
No, I'm being facetious. If you got to go to Amazon, go to Amazon. So you get it there. And I do plan on doing some interviews again in December, I think, on this. So just follow me on Facebook for those updates. And yeah, that's basically it.
And you got a channel too. Put in a plug for that.
Oh yeah, my slowly encroaching channel, Classical Christian Thought, or you could just type in Erick Ybarra on YouTube; it'll come up. You can
Awesome.
subscribe and help me out.
You got a website too, right? Are you still posting on the website?
Yeah, so if you like, all my blogs and things from the past, has been up now for like 5 years, and it's erickybarra.wordpress.org or .com. If you just Erick Ybarra in the Google, I recently stopped paying for the erickybarra.org.
Okay.
I now have another website, erickybarra.com, which is just under construction. But if you go there, you get links to all of my books and descriptions and things like that. So erickybarra.com and then erickybarra.org, it'll bring you to my WordPress, a blog for my articles and things like that. I still post articles, more of me like testing the waters with things, loaded with typos. It's just a place for me to practice my shooting,
Sure. Yeah. And y'all go also check out the website, because he's mentioning there, you got your links to the other books. You also have the Filioque book. You have one on baptism, I believe, in the early church.
Yes. So talking about like the claims of Father Peter Hears and some of the the issue of rebaptism in Orthodoxy and in the ancient fathers. So it's a very small book, like 88 pages. It's like a booklet. You could probably read it at a doctor's office in one sitting. And then on the Filioque, that one is really a fun book. It was really fun book. And then the just shall live by faith. That's the issue of justification with Protestant teaching and things like that.
And then the Melchizedek book on the real presence. So,
Melchizedek and real presence. Yeah, thanks for mentioning it.
Yeah, y'all go and check it out. Once again, thank you so much for coming on, Erick. I really appreciate you and enjoyed this interview and the book. Great job on it.
Thank you so much.
Everybody hit that like button and the subscribe button. And lastly, check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support me. God bless. Oh, wait, before you go, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting this channel. This is my primary means to provide for my family, and it also helps me to produce content like this video. If you would like to support me, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/Reason and Theology. You'll also get access to extra exclusive content when you become a patron. Lastly, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a comment down below. God bless. Hey, RNT fans, just a quick word about one of our sponsors, Verbum. It's an excellent Bible and theological software. Simply go to verbum.com/reason, where you can get 10% off any of the packages that you choose, along with 5 extra books, and you'll be supporting